Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a financial advisor before making any investment decisions. We've been focused on U.S. bonds and the U.S. dollar in recent newsletters and videos. In this session, I want to distill the short-term and long-term regarding both bonds and the U.S. dollar into what is now actually occurring. I believe that the U.S. debt and its publicly traded instruments are now a confidence game that can only be best described as a classic Ponzi scheme. I'm not suggesting it was ever intended to be such, but it has nevertheless become one. This is not too different to the infamous Bernie Madoff, who remorsefully claimed it was never his intention to be embroiled in a Ponzi scheme, but that due to circumstances and pressures he became trapped into taking this route of a hoped financial escape from circumstantial problems, an escape which only trapped him permanently and ruined everyone in his path. I hope to show you this is what has happened with U.S. debt and its financial instruments as we go through the agenda items shown here. Let's start with understanding what is meant by a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme is built on the basis of basically, most fundamentally, robbing Peter to pay Paul. A Ponzi scheme is a form of fraud that lures investors and pays profits to the early investors with funds from the more recent investors. The scheme leads victims to believe that profits are coming from legitimate investment, and they remain unaware that other investors are the source of any funds they might extract from their initial investment. A key to any Ponzi scheme is that it must maintain an illusion of wealth and value creation, and this will occur as long as new investors contribute new funds, as long as most of the investors do not demand full repayment, and investors maintain confidence in and believe in the non-existent assets they are purported to own. So how does this relate to the U.S. debt? The fact that the U.S. debt is now so large it is mathematically impossible to ever be paid back does not make it a Ponzi scheme. A terrible credit risk maybe, but not a Ponzi scheme. However, the size of the debt leads to becoming entrapped, like Madoff, in a scheme and further schemes to keep a possible collapse from occurring. Before I leave the U.S. debt, let's just make sure what we are talking about and why any collapse is just unthinkable. The U.S. fiscal debt, we are told, and is reported, is approximating $28 trillion. But that's not the debt, because it does not include unfunded entitlements such as Social Security, Medicare, that are part of any normal corporation's forced bookkeeping to actually put those commitments on their books. The U.S. government doesn't do that conveniently. That totals $84 trillion. But that's not the debt. What is the debt is what is referred to as a U.S. fiscal gap, and you never hear that mentioned, but the U.S. fiscal gap, because it includes what is referred to as contingent liabilities. What is a contingent liability? That is where the United States guarantees some country or some situation debt. It doesn't give the money out. For example, financial aid to a country such as Egypt. They don't give the Egyptian government money. What they do is guarantee the bank loans that the Egyptian government will take out. The money is made by the banks. Egypt gets the money, and the United States just shows it as a contingent liability in case Egypt, or whatever the contingent liability is tied to, does not in fact come through. We're on the hook for it. So in actual fact, all of our debt instruments are really wrapped around these individual debt levels. Normally, how the U.S. and other countries handle too large a debt initially is through macroprudential strategies such as what is commonly referred to as financial repression. This was successfully implemented by the U.S. after World War II to handle the massive debt incurred by the war and avoid making the same mistake as the Versailles Agreement regarding war reparations after World War I. Financial repression is about central banks pegging, controlling, or managing short-term interest rates below the inflation rate. By lower rates, it effectively extracts wealth creation from your bank account and future earnings to indirectly pay down public debt. It also steals growth from the economy through zero interest rates and money printing to inflate away government debt. Most fundamentally, the problem is that no longer can U.S. financial repression handle the containment of the degree of this debt. The scale is just too large. But what makes the problem intractable is that the 10-year U.S. note is the basis for the global risk-free benchmark, and the US dollar is the global reserve currency. Any serious problem with the U.S. debt financing instruments and the global economy is dramatically impacted through its U.S. debt holdings and the euro-dollar funding system. How this becomes a Ponzi scheme is that the games that are played to keep the debt afloat become forcing functions for further schemes. The existing U.S. debt is now never paid for out of current revenues, but simply rolled over and only interest is paid. This is best thought of as being similar to you still paying the interest on all the cars you ever owned because you never paid off any principal and just kept rolling over the debt into the next set of ever increasing monthly car payments. The U.S. also uses Social Security funds to buy U.S. treasuries and now also uses quantitative easing to buy U.S. treasuries. Both just reduce the imbalance from a lack of new investors who no longer want to buy sufficient levels of ever-increasing U.S. debt. To keep the wealth effect going and its tax revenues being generated over the last 15 years, the U.S. monetary policy has been forced into policies that can best be described as monetary malpractice. This has led to dysfunctional financial markets with malinvestment and delusional expectations disconnected from historical fundamentals. All of this is the entrapment that has occurred, but it still doesn't make it a Ponzi scheme. What makes it a Ponzi scheme is when fraud occurs to keep investors from knowing material investment information. An accurate and honest reporting of inflation is central to properly assessing an investment in U.S. debt and the U.S. dollar that supports it. Does anyone today believe the CPI, which determines, for example, retirement COLA adjustments for retirees, is even close to reality? Of course not. We've accepted that our government lies to us because, frankly, no matter who we elect, nothing ever changes. This diagram, which I've shown many times before, produced by John Williams at shadowstats.com, shows the reality that U.S. inflation, as measured by 1980 government measures of inflation, is actually nearing 14%. This matches the reality of what is occurring. However, through statistical games such as substitution, hedonics, imputation, and changing baskets of goods, the government is now potentially, or more seriously, intentionally misleading investors. I don't want to use the F word here, but what would you call this? I wrote a 111-page thesis paper back in 2017 laying out how economic growth in the U.S. is being incorrectly reported. This is another example of misrepresentation of the facts, which are misleading to investors. We are further along the stagnation event horizon than many understand, also leading to serious misunderstandings of the consequence of the size of the U.S. debt. The trap is forcing the central banks to distort messages, such as that the current inflation rate is transitory. This is simply not true. The questionable use of owner-occupied rent in the CPI inflation metric, for example, accounts for 1/3 of the measure. How is it that rents are unquestionably skyrocketing nationally, yet the Fed makes such a claim? Are they expecting rents to be slashed later while house prices only continue to climb? The Fed's narrative or spin has now reached the point of no longer actually passing anyone's common sense anymore. The U.S. labor shortage is now showing itself on every street in America. Worker wanted signs proliferate, yet the Fed sees this as only transitory. People are quitting jobs while corporations can't get enough skilled workers, which is forcing wages up, and signing incentives are now being offered within a broad array of industries. How does this not show itself in cost push inflation and companies going to be forced to pass increased labor costs onto consumers? Does the Fed expect wages to go down later? These examples of what appears to be misrepresentation of reality is part of keeping confidence high for U.S. Treasuries and the U.S. dollar. The central part of a Ponzi scheme is maintaining confidence in the scheme. That is why it is appropriately called a con, or confidence game. The sovereign currency and the U.S. dollar specifically historically tracks a country's twin deficits in the longer term. The current spending by the U.S. government is already taking a bad situation and making it a potential disaster. We can only conclude the powers to be have simply no choice but to do this. Like Bernie Madoff, they are trapped in a stew of their own making. The U.S. trade deficit is now the second largest in 29 years. The current account set a record in Q1 and will only get worse with current spending plans. The U.S. fiscal budget deficit is also at historic levels, while total debt as a percentage of GDP has pushed the U.S. above the danger level, where new stimulus only erodes growth because the debt burden is bigger than the gains from further stimulus. Further debt and liquidity increases can only temporarily help asset appreciation and maintain the wealth effect. These are policies of desperation which most Ponzi schemes must resort as their scheme begins to come apart. Current U.S. policies have reversed the U.S. energy independence, and the U.S. has now become energy dependent on foreign oil. The OPEC cartel has been quick to take advantage of this, which Americans are already seeing at the gas pumps. How exactly is energy dependence going to be temporary? What can we conclude? Policies of financial repression can only be expected to get worse and more aggressive. The U.S. dollar will only continue to weaken further in the short term and eventually in the longer term. The Ponzi scheme will simply go on until something breaks somewhere, because unlike a true Ponzi scheme, there are no financial investigators or cops on this particular beat. The government can tell us anything they want with impunity. We need to remember that we the people are responsible for who we elect, and we hold them accountable. We the people are both ultimately responsible and the dupes for allowing this to occur. How this ends is that we should expect a correction in income distribution because wages and disposable income don't match any kind of standard of living, which will lead to faster wage growth, which is already beginning, and higher inflation, which we're seeing every day. That in turn will lead to more restrictive monetary policies and higher inflation-adjusted interest rates. The more restrictive monetary policy will then stabilize asset prices and wealth, forcing deleveraging. And that deleveraging will lead to a recession due to the necessary fall in demand among households, companies, and governments. A recession and a sustained U.S., what I call the Great Stagflation, will end the Ponzi scheme. As I always remind you in these videos, remember politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and almost all problems until such time as no one will actually take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom actually been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not necessarily following what has been the traditional true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2021 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I sincerely thank you for listening.